Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Lee Rusznyak. I'm the director of the WITS LCT Hub. I'm based in Johannesburg in South Africa. And I'm going to be sharing some of my work on teacher education and work-based learning, preparing students for work-based learning.
I'm a PhD candidate, and I handed in my thesis in May this year. So now I'm a lecturer at the University College Copenhagen, waiting to defend my thesis. And I went down to visit Lee in fall last year. In Denmark, there is a requirement that all the PhD students, as part of the PhD program, has a change of research environment. And I had previously worked with Betzer as the primary theoretical resource when I was introduced to LCT by a colleague, Annette Hindhed, who's also here today, I saw. But I had reached a point where Betzer's theoretical framework was in some way not enough. So I wrote to Lee and asked her if it was possible for me to visit her. Unfortunately, she said yes. Because even though teachers' education and nursing educations are not exactly the same, many of the same issues are present, and our interests lay within the same areas of the respective education. So therefore, I went down to Johannesburg in fall 2023. And I thought that I was going to finish an article based on some data that I already had using the specialization dimension of LCT. But of course, it wasn't that easy. And Lee, with her knowledge, made me realize that specialization wasn't the right dimension for the data that I already had. Because there wasn't anything new, just like I experienced with Betzer. It was not possible to get deep enough to catch the organizing principles. So going to Johannesburg and working on a daily basis with Lee and her colleagues greatly expanded and nuanced my understanding of LCT. And Lee in particular was a tremendous help and remain a major professional inspiration for me. So thank you, Lee, for taking me under your wings. And she's the last author on the article I'll present something from today. So.
Great, thank you. Just before we carry on, can I ask, Mandy, I think that there was something that you did on the computer that made a green light appear. If it's possible to delete that. Thank you so much. And then those ones as well. Great. Thanks. Okay, so what is our problem? And this was one of the core quotes that I actually built my PhD around. And it's still, even though it's a 1988 reading, it's still very, very much part of a huge problem that I think is prevalent, and it's something that I'm still addressing. So yes, work-based learning can be amazing. It can, lead you to self-discovery, reflection, amazing mentoring, amazing support, incredible learning, but it also has the potential to do actually very, very little. In fact, Calderhead talked about just hit and miss, sink or swim, trial and error. Where you actually just don't know what you're doing. Let's try something, see if it works. And you're going about it in a very unsystematic way. Simply, going through the motions, doing the routines, modeling, imitation of what people are doing without actually knowing what you're doing and why. But, you look like you're okay. You look like you're coping, but actually it's very little than that. A place where you can accumulate a whole bag of tricks but actually that's all you've got at the end. You haven't got an insight into what you're doing and how those tricks, why they work and how they work. Or a time of cementing pre-existing misconceptions where you just really never get out of your comfort zone. I wanted to add something to that. Work-based learning can be an opportunity where you're simply collecting hours but you're actually not learning anything of substance. So that's the problem that we're dealing with. Is it's a hit and miss affair. And how do we make sure that we set up students for success? And not just if they happened to have the kind of educational path that helps them to learn in practice, or if they happen to land themselves with a particularly good supervisor, but how do we have quality work-based learning across the board for all of the students? That's the quest, that's the problem, that's what our research today is going to talk about. So today's session, we're going to look at what enables students to make the most of their time in the workplace, where it's not a matter of just accumulating hours, but they're actually doing worthwhile learning. And so to do that, we're going to do three things. We're going to first introduce our study, and I'm going to introduce the LCT concepts that we're using. We're going to look at two studies. I'm going to talk about preparing student teachers for classroom learning, and Cecile's going to look at supporting student nurses during their home-based visits. And then we're going to come back to the LCT. What do we learn about LCT? What do we learn about semantics? And what do we learn about improving student learning in the workplace from these two studies? So the first one that we're going to be looking at is student nurses. Cecile's going to look at two options there. What happens with mentor supervision and what happens without mentor supervision. And I'm going to be looking at student teaching in the class, student teaching, and preparing them for going back to the classroom. Remember, they've already spent 12 years or more in classroom environments, but so you might expect that they don't need to be formally introduced to classroom life because they've spent years and years there. But what happens without a structured preparation to classroom life, and what happens with a structured preparation? So I want to introduce you to 4 boxes, and the reason that I'm putting the boxes up is because a lot of the research in teacher education, and I think in nursing education as well, has kind of been based on knowledge typologies, boxes of knowledge, and then sorting out what knowledge goes into what box. So, for example, you're talking about theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge and professional knowledge as if they are all just boxes of knowledge, and that they're quite separate from one another. So the boxes of knowledge, the knowledge typologies, gives us some interesting ideas because it actually puts knowledge up there, that it's an important thing. But once something's in the box, we can't really see what's happening inside that box. We can't see how things change over time. So the boxes are quite restrictive in a lot of ways. So let's get rid of the boxes. I'm taking the boxes out. And what LCT does, which I think is this is what really, really appeals to me and why I found it so useful, is it starts looking at what organizing principles generate these types of knowledge. So one of the ones that is part of the semantics dimension of LCT is looking at the issue of context dependence. Now, everything has some sort of dependence on context. It can be strongly tied to context or weakly tied to context. And so you have these different levels of context dependence, where perhaps practical knowledge and professional knowledge has more context dependence, and maybe rules and theoretical knowledge has less context dependence because they can be enacted over many different contexts. The other principle is one of complexity. and practices vary in their complexity. And what we see is that the combination of context dependence and complexity then starts to generate these kinds of knowledge. And let's now go into the LCT of this. So there we have, we're going to first take away the boxes because we don't need boxes anymore, because now instead of looking at just categories, we're looking at strengths. So the context dependence is enacted by semantic gravity, where there's more context dependence, we call that stronger levels of semantic gravity, SG+, where the context dependence is much weaker, we've got weaker semantic gravity, SG-. And for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to always put semantic gravity in blue. Similarly, complexity is reflected in the strength of semantic density, where weaker semantic density reflects simpler practices, and stronger semantic density reflects more complex, more networked, more condensed practices. So because we've got rid of the boxes, we can now start to look at positions on a plane, and what governs those different positions. So now, instead of categories of knowledge, or boxes of knowledge, practical, theoretical, professional, and so on, we've got codes that generate these kinds of knowledge. And in our studies on student work-based learning, these codes generated tips and rules and experience and so on. But in a different practice, like, for example, karate, they would look completely different. You wouldn't have things like professional knowledge and practical knowledge. So it's just how it manifests. That's why it's an example, how it manifests in our study. So the codes then govern these analytically distinct areas of the semantic plane. So this is all called the semantic plane. And then what we can actually do, and I've put them in purple because they depend on a combination of semantic gravity and semantic density. So you can see there are three different positions. Each of them is defined by a particular strength of semantic gravity and a particular strength of semantic density. And together, those pinpoint a point on the semantic plane. For example, A has weaker semantic density than B. B has stronger semantic density than A. C has stronger semantic gravity than A and B. And so we've got a much more nuanced way of representing change, distribution, what's happening where, when, and how. So just to put it in a kind of a framework, LCT, a multi-dimensional framework for analyzing practices. So we're going to show you that, how we've used this to analyze practice and for seeing possibilities for how to change them. And the other dimensions we're not looking at today, but we are going to focus on semantics. And we're going to look at, in this situation, what form does knowledge take? What codes are the students enacting, and how does that change when we change certain variables? Okay, Cecile, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So what I'm going to talk about today is the third sub-study of my PhD, which is broadly examine the social and academic implication of establishing an honor track in nursing education within an otherwise... Oh, All right. Egalitarian and state-funded educational system. This sub-study looks at the extent to which the honors program provides students with a better way in for decoding and enacting their clinical placement in home-based care, which is the specific focus of the honors program in general, elderly multi-sick patient in primary care. So this area within nursing stands out in many ways compared to, for example, clinical placement in highly specialized hospital departments. So in home-based care, the nurses go out to the patient's home and visit and do the care in their own home. So what I wanted to examine was laid out very simple. If the more education that the honors students got helped them in clinical practice, if they got more professional, so to say, so thus honors is only an extreme case of nursing education here. So in the design arrangement, it was not intentional that some students were with a supervisor and some were not. In Danish nursing education, it is not a requirement for students to be with a mentor on a daily basis, but I was nevertheless very surprised that 3 out of the 4 students that I shadowed, were consistently alone in their clinical placement. So in processing my data with Lee's help, it became clear that where I thought that I was going to focus on knowledge and knowers in the specialization dimension, as I mentioned before, something else stood out much more clearly: the opportunity and limitation for knowledge building analyzed using semantic range. So I followed 4 students for 2 days each doing their home-based visits. And I was using, shadowing, ethnography, and maybe it wasn't the most appropriate method, but as I said, I came down to Lee with my data, so I had already collected my data when I came down there. Yeah, and the next slide. Thank you. So after Lee and I had talked about the different dimensions of LCT and used, I think, like the first week of my stay to decide that semantic would be the most appropriate dimension for analyze, we develop a translation device inspired by Sheng and Maton, which can articulate the coding of what is observed as respectively semantic gravity and semantic density, and it also helps to ensure the transparency between the empirical data that I collected and the analyze. And since semantics is always present, as Lee just said, its relative strengths will often fluctuate throughout the series of actions, as I'll exemplify here. So tasks performed in isolation, such as recording a temperature, represent a weaker semantic density, whereas interpretation, which involves some sensitivity and understanding of a given problem, enhances semantic density. And in the context of, for example, temperature measurement, it could be that the student consider what a potential increase in temperature might be due to what treatment options that are available, pharmacological or non-pharmacological, what makes sense, when to contact the doctor, what he or she could do at the patient's own home, and where to incorporate other colleagues and so on. So strengthening the semantic density requires some kind of theoretical insights from different scientific areas and drawing the connection based on past experience also. So unlike the study that Lee will show later on, we choose in this study to compare the relationship between semantic gravity and semantic density visualized as distribution on the semantic plane. Since the students were observed throughout entire workdays, it meant that there were an incredible number of records that each students did in their action. For example, changing a wound or dressing a wound consists of a series of actions. And this approach made it possible to count how many times the students position themselves within each of the four quadrants in relation to the total number of entries, and thereby making it possible for us to calculate the percent of share in each position there. So here is a couple of examples of how.
Oh, Cecilie, before you move on, you can go back one. I would just say, I would just encourage you and others to flip the semantic gravity so that the weaker is always on top, because then we can all get on the same page with the way in which we present semantic gravity. And also because it then is a lot easier to read both the tables. I always read the tables from the bottom up, because we tend to go, it's a lot easier to talk about the stronger and then articulating or levitating away from it, or the simpler and going to complex. So, but if we can get the semantic gravity always in the opposite way around, because that's the way we put it on the plane.
Thank you.
And also it's because the way we think about it. I've just written a great long thing in chapter 7 draft about the fact that, you know, it's several millennia now of people thinking of the abstract and the general up here and the concrete and the instance down here. So there's not much I can do about that, you know. So unfortunately, that means the minus is at the top and people just have to live with it. But if we can just keep it consistent, then it makes it a lot easier for people to really follow what you're doing, and from there to the tape, from there to the plane. That's all.
Yeah. Thank you, Carl. Yes. Yeah. Here's an example from an observation where the student, without a supervisor, going alone in the patient's own home, is out to dispense medication for a patient. And I'll just give you 30 seconds just to read the data on the right side. So as you can see, we coded each of the different steps in the action and plotted into the semantic plane. And without a supervisor, you can see that the majority of the time is spent on everyday things, and the student, despite of the seriousness of the situation, mostly remain in the prosaic code. Only one time she moves out to the D, where she systematically check if the medication is right compared to the prescription, and then she moves back to the prosaic code alone. So she never managed to increase the semantic density alone, even though from a nursing perspective, there are lots of possibilities to increase the semantic density. I have another example where the student is with a supervisor. Yeah, and I'll just give you 30 seconds to read the right side again. So as we can see on this semantic plane, the pattern change. If the students, when the students are without a supervisor, it's not always naturally strengthen the semantic density, but we see here how the supervisor prompts the students' actions and reflections. Thus, we see that when the supervisor assists the students through guidance and reflection, a more intricate semantic structure with repeated shift becomes evident. She's moving from A to B back to the prosaic code and strengthen the identity and so on. So the supervisor compels the student to recognize the importance of having nursing relevant theoretical knowledge from multiple fields. In this context, it could be knowledge about wounds or hygiene or infection or pain theory and so on, which is at the same time conceptually complex and contextually relevant for the situation. So the supervisor thus contributes to a broader semantic scope by making the known unknown and the unknown known, by repacking, and unpacking on the way. And in the article, I called it that the supervisor is becoming some sort of midwife for the student's opportunity to transfer knowledge from the left side of the quadrant to the right side. And when all these data are compiled and rewritten as presented, it becomes clear that the unsupervised students spend the majority of their time on the left side of the quadrant, with the main emphasis on the prosaic code, whereas the supervised students show minimal shift between the different codes. Yeah, so I see more than half, 52%, of the students' actions and reflections are positioned in the prosaic code without a supervisor, characterized by the context without articulated reasoning, even when I, as a researcher, ask them, why did you do that? What do you think about that? And so on. And since nursing in itself is deeply rooted in practice, with patients regarded as the primary object for action, student often begins with a strong semantic gravity and then proceed to solve the assigned task, transitioning to a weakening of the semantic gravity, shifting their focus from the patient to the task, but rarely strengthening the semantic density. This means that only 11% of the data has more complexity, with only 7% bring together complex insights, SD plus, SD plus. So this pattern suggests that students enact tasks as a series of isolated actions wherein knowledge is selectively drawn from specific domains without establishing connection to more comprehensive practice-based implication. So in this context, we can see how without guidance, these home-based visits easily become dominated by the logic of work or the logic of the task, which can result in a more cynical orientation with a tendency to prioritize surveys and market-driven logics over the focus of care. Not because the students don't want to do care or practice care, but rather because they fail to perceive the place of care in the task. So if we're looking at the other figure with a supervisor, where the students got supervision, we see how supervision is help strengthening the semantic density, which is not always naturally manifest, as we saw on the other one. When the supervisor assists the student through guidance and prompts and so on, a more intricate semantic structure with repeated shift in position becomes evident. So often these shifts involve a collaboration between the supervisor and the students, where the supervisor helps unpack and repack through questions like, so what are you thinking here, and why is that, and what else could it be, and if it's not that, what then? So the supervisor contributes to a significantly broader semantic scope that incorporates various semantic codes. So by using semantic distribution patterns, it became obvious that supervision plays an essential role in the student's opportunity for knowledge building, because the competence profile for a graduated nurse aims for both a strong semantic gravity and a strong semantic density, which hardly can be reached by the student by themselves. So with a supervisor present alongside the student, there were 3 times as many instances of complex insight, 7 times more incorporation of theoretical insight from the semantic codes, and in general, a much greater complexity and integration were evident, demonstrated by the activities spanning across the semantic plane as a whole. Yeah. So that was the past presentation of that study.
Hey, you're muted.
Yeah, just to ask if there's anybody who wants to ask anything more about that study before we move on to the next one.
No, that's a good opportunity, yeah, for people to just take a moment to take that in and just jump in if you feel like. I mean, I think a study like that is has implications far beyond, obviously beyond the topic, because we're often being asked what we offer as supervisors in all sorts of situations. What we bring as experts to apprentices, what we bring as supervisors in PhD situations, for example. And the value added, as it were, as the university managers would probably want to think about it. And it could be that it is a case of the supervisors are in the best situations enabling or bringing the student more towards the complex, and perhaps also up to the more abstract, as it were, when they bring them repeatedly back from the day-to-day, in those contexts. And then we might then think about how there are moments also, and I know this often happens for me in sociology, where the value I'm adding is sometimes bring the students down from being lost in lofty waffle as they do that horrendous descent into thinking they need to understand epistemology, and then thinking they need to understand ontology, and then disappearing into the history of Western philosophy and never seeing them again. So bringing them down to the practical and the simple and saying, how do you solve your problem? So shifting them around the plane is one of the things that pedagogic work is definitely involved in. I don't know, yeah, Annette, hand raised, just jump in, yes.
Right. Thank you. And thank you very much for a nice presentation, Cecilia. You said that you came with the data to Lee and needed to make the most of it. So my question to you is, if you should redo your study, what kind of data would you construct in order to make more sense in an LCT manner?
I think it would still be appropriate to do some kind of ethnography, but I would approach it from a didactic angle instead, knowing what to look for, because I thought I was going to use visualization. So for me, it was very important in my observations also to see how they interacted with the workplace as well. So I collected data on what's in the room, how do they talk to each other, what tasks are they assigned for, and so on. If I had my stay with Lee before collecting the data, I think I would be more precise in the relation between the nursing students and the patients. So collecting even or be more focused on their actions with the patients out there, only on the medical part or on the nursing part, not on the organizational tasks as much as I have. So there's a lot of lost data. Oh, yeah.
So can I just pop in there as well, just to add my 2 cents worth before we die? You can absolutely reanalyze this data with specialization, with autonomy. You could go to the social codes, social plane. I think that it would show a huge amount. But when I was looking at it, just the semantics just jumped up and said, hey, there's something so fascinating going on here. And that was why we had a conversation like, okay, so if we proceed with the specialization, what story are you going to be able to tell? And if you change to the semantics, what story could you tell? And for me, it was like lots of people are making claims about, supervision and whatever. As Carl said, what's the value added? Very, very few people can prove it empirically. And I just thought that this would be such an incredible way of grounding it. So I thought that there was a really exciting. It's not to say that there's not a story to tell, with using specialization or using autonomy, but I just thought that the story with semantics was particularly like urgent and crucial, and could speak to huge problems in the field and beyond.
Don?
Yes, thank you, Lee, and thanks, Cecile. And probably to build on some of the ways that you and Carl have just got us thinking. So, Cecile, I was wondering, do the supervisors have to evidence any qualification in order to be a supervisor? And did you notice any difference in the quality of the supervision? So were some supervisors more able to enable the nurses on practice? So again, using that data perhaps to feed back to the supervisors and their own qualification or the quality of their work.
That's one of the limitations, that I only followed those 4 students and one with the supervisor, and there's definitely differences between the supervisors as well. They're humans, so but they have qualification. They have 30 ECTS. That's a half year of study in supervising. So they have qualifications, but of course, if the saturation was better, then I would have seen different kinds of supervision as well. So of course, that's a limitation for the study, that this supervisors, or the 2 that I saw, they were magnificent, and they know what they were doing, and they know how to talk to me as well as a researcher, telling me all the good things, and were very conscious about me being there. So of course there will be differences if I have followed most supervisors as well.
But also, you are both a researcher and a supervisor yourself. You've worked with student nurses, so you were able to draw on your experience as a supervisor in your, So why did you need to do that? And to prompt those kind of questions, isn't it?
Yeah, but actually, I've asked you and Carl about that before. If that is a limitation, or that is something good, that you feel that good. Because when I'm drawing on my knowledge as a supervisor or a nurse, can I be as objective as I should all the way? We've talked a lot about that, Lee. I know I've asked you the question. I'll just throw that here too. I know Annette and I have talked about it as well. Is it always good to know you feel that good?
Well, there's an easy way around that, which is to give, to find somebody else or a couple of other people or whatever it is, and give them your translation device and a bit of your data, and get them to do a bit of inter-rater reliability. It does kind of crush that sense of, but it's just subjective and it's just qualitative, and it's quite a powerful thing to do. Hannah Giorgio did it for her study of university physics assessment. So she had a little group in Sydney University at the time, and she was doing a PhD of physics education researchers. They didn't necessarily know that much about LCT, but she just walked them through the translation device, made it clear, and they got something like 90%, I think it was, inter-rater reliability, which was far higher than they did when they tried using something else called the solo taxonomy, which had dominated that sort of thinking before. So it's kind of like, it's a really powerful thing to show that, I brought all my expertise as an insider. That's great. And then I tested it with other insiders as well, and we all seem to agree. And I don't see why that's a problem, because then you've gone beyond the purely singular subjective to some sort of intersubjectivity, which is simply the basis of objectivity anyway. I mean, to be honest, there's a point at which we have to draw a line somewhere eventually about who's going to be able to understand stuff, and being able to work out what they're doing is really important. So it's the sort of thing you can raise as questions and so on, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. And as I said, interrelated reliability is always a good way of doing something. to see if it's also a good way of seeing whether you're making sense in your translation device as well, because we think we know what we're talking about, and then when you ask somebody else. So Lee will tell you this, is that I have a tendency to really have a beginner's mind when I talk to somebody about a translation device. Lee and I worked on one that had already been developed, and I just kept saying, I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means. I don't know what it means. It's because there's so much that one puts into one's own study and one's own translation devices that you just kind of assume there's knowledge because you are an insider. And I think that's probably more of a concern or trouble than anything else, which is one takes things for granted. One takes it as goes without saying. And for a translation device, you want it to be said. It has to be explicit. And that's the point of a translation device. So I annoyed Lee endlessly because I just kept saying, no, I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means. And like, she was like, yeah, but it means this. And I say, not to me, it doesn't. So that doesn't mean anything to me. I'm not a teacher trainer and I don't know this area. And so, it also can be helpful to work with someone to just say, can you help to see if this is something you understand? Well, I mean, it might be somebody in your field, but it's even better if it's somebody who isn't. I don't just mean any person off the street, whatever. I mean, fellow researcher or PhD student or whatever it might be. It can be really helpful. If they can follow your translation device, it's really explicit at that point. But I'm talking about things like I saw many translation devices which say things like, they use words that just mean nothing to me. Like there'll be stuff that says, the students give a sophisticated response. And I'm like, I don't know what the fuck that means. Sophisticated, what does that mean? That's like an insider value judgment. I don't know what that means. And for somebody else to be able to use it, like me, I'm not going to be able to use that translation device because I'm going to be sitting there going, what does sophisticated mean? So it's really useful for unpacking those things.
Yeah. Carl, I'm sorry I couldn't find my raising hand gestures, but can I also ask a question?
Yeah, just jump in, people.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for Cecilie and Lee. I just wonder if you check anything or did you realize something based on involvement of patients during these home visits? Because, sometimes patients' involvement also can change these practices based on unpacking and repacking during this process. Have you realized anything related to this during your session? I just want to ask this one firstly, and I have one more question, maybe after this one.
Yeah, definitely the patients are teachers or supervisors as well, but it demands for the students to catch when the patients are trying or saying something that I as a nurse think, oh my God, they just laid out to catch this one, to move on. It's not always when they're alone that they have the ability to do that. Often when the patient is giving them something, they are so task orientated in their work that they simply don't see it out there. But when a supervisor is with the students out there, the supervisor helps the student to say, what about listening to Gerda? She just told you that, something like that. And then they catch the clue.
So,
yeah. But again, the saturation is so low. I only followed 4 nursing students. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I have one general question, maybe. Of course, we saw, your semantic plans for a second, so I couldn't, see the differences clearly in this limited process. But did you also represent this one through semantic waves, or how did you represent, this kind of stuff in your PhD or in your monograph or articles?
Actually, in the article, I present a plane for the students without supervisor as one, and then I make a plane for the students with supervisor, but without interaction from the supervisor, one for the supervisor, what she or he does, and then I combine the two as
to
one.
See the difference in one.
Yeah. Because it's like seeing the same situation for different angles.
So you can definitely do, the profiles if you wanted to, write another paper. But this paper was about the distribution across the plane. Hey?
Yeah.
Your data lends itself to doing that if you wanted to.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Great. Okay, so the next study then is going into away from Denmark and student nursing into student teachers in South Africa. And, they've been sitting in the schools for 12 years already. They've watched lessons for their entire life. And now we're wanting them to go and watch more lessons, but perhaps seeing things differently. So what do they see without a structured preparation, and what do they see with it? And that's going to be what I'm going to be presenting on this time. So the realities of the South African classroom, and of course teaching student teachers in South Africa, they're coming from such diverse backgrounds, schooling contexts. So there's huge variation in the schools and in the background and the educational experiences of the students who come into the teaching program. Now, the problem is that when they go back into the schools, across the board, there's research that shows there's widespread teacher absenteeism. The teachers take it as a chance to get their abscesses and the corns and the hysterectomies and bunions sorted out. So basically what I'm saying here is that students are very often left to cope on their own without the support of a teacher. Classrooms in South Africa, probably you're looking at 40, 60, 85 students in a class. So, there's always things that are happening, and there's very seldom time to sit and talk. There's lots and lots of emotional and social support. Teachers are a very community orientated groups, and you'll take your chicken and share it over lunch, and very, very social. But whether there's pedagogic support, not so much. Teachers tend to do teaching rather than talk about it, what they're doing. And so then the problems about, mimicry and imitation are quite real, because you don't know what you're doing and why you're doing it. You're just kind of copying what's happening around you. And that could maybe be okay, I suppose, if you had a really functional education system. But in the South African context, about 80% of schools are really, really struggling, where kids are not reading for meaning. So if student teachers go in and simply just copy prevalent practices, they could very, very well be perpetuating things that don't work, or they're left to sink and swim because they're left to their own devices. And in spite, with all of this, there are calls for much, much more school-based time, less time at university, because theory doesn't matter. What matters is what you do in the classroom. So one of the study that I'm going to do is trying to speak some evidence into this kind of situation. So about this study, what we've done is we've taken students who've now been 12 years in their school, and they've come into a teacher education program. So they would have been in schools in, the year before, December. And our university year starts in early February. So you can see the months of the year: January, February, March. So what we did was we asked the students on their very, very first week of their teacher education. So they've not done lectures yet. They haven't done practicals yet. They've come straight out of school. and we asked them to watch a lesson. So that's that kind of that arrow there pointing to late, mid-February, early March. And we asked them the 3 questions. What happens in the lesson? What does the teacher do and why? And what other comments do you want to make on that lesson? So what we really have there is we've captured how they would notice teaching without any kind of teacher education, preparation, insight from theories. As they come out of school, that's what they can do. We gave them coursework in the year, and then early in August, after they'd done a whole lot of coursework, which I'll tell you about, we asked them to watch the same lesson and answer the same questions. And those 2 points, those 2 lesson observations, the one written first and the one written second, are the 2 data sources for this study. Once they had done that observation, that lesson observation, that was the very last thing that they did before they went back into schools in August and September. And then they came back to campus October and November, and we gave them a final exam. So let's see what did they see in the lesson in August that they didn't see in February. So these are just common things that I took out of their first lesson observation. It was a lesson on peer pressure. Dale and I have done a couple of presentations where we talk about a different study about before and after a module called Teacher Choices in Action. This is a different study, but it uses the same lesson. And so these were the sort of things that students were saying in their first lesson observation. This is the focus of what they were writing about. What does the teacher do and why? She speaks loudly. Why? So that children can hear. She asks questions. Why does she ask questions? To encourage participation. Or also she asks questions to see if the children understand. She uses different strategies to help them understand. She improves understanding. She helps them pay attention. She uses group work so that the lessons become more enjoyable. And when the kids get a right answer, they clap, and it makes the learning fun. And the clapping makes the children feel proud of themselves. So these are the very, very typical things that the students would write about in their first observation. And what we noticed from this is totally focused on what the kids are doing, how they're participating, when they're participating, when they're not participating. So now they're doing this, now they're doing that, now they're doing something else. They were very much focused on the children, not just participating, but whether they were having fun. And they were enjoying themselves, and the lesson was enjoyable, and so on. There was lots and lots of quotes about that. And there was a lot of quotes about, the teachers doing all these things to promote learning or to help them understand, but no real unpacking of what that means. So let me give you, this is drawn from a whole lot of students, but let me give you one example from one student. To analyze it and to look at the basis of, how it changed in complexity, we worked just with semantic density. So I'm not focused on semantic gravity at all in the study, so that's why it's only red. The weakest semantic density was they described the teacher's actions, but without suggesting reasons for those actions, like the teacher checks on the groups. She identifies with certain words. She defines what this means. Moving up, slightly stronger, but still weak, SD minus. And here, I don't think that we've quite got that very specific, I don't have that very specific thing that maybe somebody from with outside the practice would still be able to get exactly what we mean here. But they suggest a broad reason. It's unspecified. It's for what the teacher does. And they point generally to learning or understanding or participation. So she asks questions to test their understanding. She puts them in teams so that they can participate. So it's really, very, very, very general reasons rather than things that are specific. Going into a stronger semantic density now, SD+, they suggest an educational reason for every action. So the teacher's doing this for this educational reason. The teacher's doing that for that educational reason. So she instilled the rules that they should raise their hand. This allows for order and for others to hear what they're saying. So there's one action and there's one reason. SD++ is where they're recognizing patterns of reason, patterns of teacher action with a whole lot of different things that the teacher's doing to get to that pattern. And they're giving overarching reasons for those patterns. So they'll say something like, she asks questions to prompt thinking. But then they'll unpack what that means. She doesn't answer the questions herself. She gives the children the opportunity to reply. She gives them time to offer, and so on. So there's a whole lot of different things that she's doing in prompting thinking. So that is our translation device from the weakest to the strongest semantic density. I've adapted it from the Langsford and Rusznyak study, but it's not exactly the same. In that study, Dale and I were looking at PGCE students over a 3-week period. This study, I'm looking at first-year students over an entire year. So the translation device needed to be changed to accommodate that. And this is also based on when Carl and I were working on rethinking and refining the translation device, a lot of this comes out of that process. And it wasn't annoying at all. I found it incredibly useful. So we got a very much more sharp translation device as a result of that. So here's an example of Nhlanhla. And this was what she wrote on her very, very first week of teacher education straight out of school. And I'll just give you a minute to glance through the different sentences. So in her first lesson observation report, Nhlanhla is talking about what the teacher does. She asks questions, she reads aloud, she asks the kids to read aloud, she summarizes, she asks them to cut out words, and it's all very based on activity, what the kids are doing. What stood out for me is that every single sentence that I've broken up here, talks about something different. So now she's asking questions. Now she's reading aloud. Now she's asking them to read out answers. Now she's asking them to summarize. So you'll see that I haven't connected the plots on the semantic profile, and that there's a reason for that, because to me, every little part was a new thing, and it didn't connect with what was happening before. There are a couple of times when she does give reasons for what she's doing. So number F, for example, to make her students understand the words, they fill in the missing words into a sentence. So, to make the students understand. So that would be SD minus, one of those broad, unspecified reasons. If you look at C, for example, the teacher allows the students to read out the answers. There's no reason for that. A, she asks questions so that they understand what peer pressure is. So there's that vague, broad, unspecified reason again. So she never ever gets to the stronger levels of semantic density, and everything is very, very much the teacher's doing this, now the teacher's doing that, and so on. Focused on activity, but not really. What I don't get a sense from here is a sense of the learning process. It's just a bit of classroom business. Now they're doing this, now they're doing something else, now they're doing something else, now they're doing that, so that they can understand. So let's see how it changed. So now let's just have a look at what the intervention was. Oh, sorry, before we go there, these are other students from the class. Nhlanhla, the one who I've just showed you, she was a distinctive student. All these other ones were actually got 65% for their final assessment task. That's why I chose them. I wanted to get what happens with a distinctive student and what happens with one that's not distinctive but very solid. But you can see that if you look at Nhlanhla's profile, it's actually very similar to Safina's, for example, where it's just those very fragmented observations and almost nothing going into stronger semantic density. Some of the others, for example, Debbie and Vanele, did a little bit more semantic shifting and reached once or twice stronger semantic density, where they gave educational reasons. The teacher's doing this for this educational reason. They were able to do that. But remember that most of it was focused on participation and on enjoyment of the lesson, with most of it just talking about they understand, or what they already know, things like that. None of them got into SD++. And all of them are quite fragmented in terms of seeing individual actions or individual activity. So that was what happened in the very, very first week of their studies. Then for the next 6 months, we did a study with them about understanding teachers' work. And really, what's central to teachers' work is working with knowledge to represent ideas and to design a learning process, a series of classroom activities where the students get to work in successively more complex ways with concepts. So there were 2 interventions. One was a first-year course called Becoming a Teacher. Dale lectures on it with me, and Alfred is also here. And the other one was our Teacher Choices in Action, which I'm going to mention a little bit later. And in that, we actually get them to observe and analyze teaching in a very scholarly way. What can they learn through experience? What can they learn from instruction? What's the difference between kind of everyday learning in your general life and formal learning that has been planned and follows a curriculum? How are ideas built together and built up through constellations? We introduce them to the ideas of semantic gravity and semantic density. And we use them to see how teachers are taking ideas, unpacking them, looking at real world applications, repacking them into complex forms. We use semantic profiles to let them think through the design of their lessons. Where are they going to start? On what point of the semantic profile? Are they going to start lower down? Are they going to start lower up? And then what? Where do they go from there on out? And we talk about the importance of decision-making in teaching in relation to the content you're teaching, in relation to the context, in relation to the needs of the kids that you are teaching. So that gives them a toolkit, a conceptual toolkit to really look at practice. And then we take them in tutorials through textbook extracts, activities, assessment tasks, and recorded lessons where we ask them to do, what is the teacher doing, why? And to start to focus their attention not just on the kids and the interaction and how lovely the teacher is and how warm and friendly they are, but what's happening to the knowledge through the lesson. And then if they can see the knowledge, they can start to notice a learning pathway. The Teacher Choices in Action module does this, but on a national scale, and it's an online module, and we've had about 70,000 student teachers from 24 universities across South Africa that have done this sort of thing, but on an online platform. So let's just have a look at now what happens when they watch that same lesson again, but now with this kind of toolkit. So this is the same student in Nhlanhla. And what's really interesting for me is that instead of all these fragments of the teacher's doing this, the teacher's doing that, the teacher's doing something else, she's actually clustered them in two parts. First, she talks in sentences A, B, C, D, is how the teacher manages students. And the second half is how the teacher is managing ideas. So if you have a look, what's so interesting for me is she starts with that the teacher manages students. So that's an overall pattern. And she starts then talking about how the teacher's doing it, pointing to them individually, expecting them to raise up, expecting them to clap when they get the right answer, moving around so that she keeps their focus. And all of that is part of this big pattern of managing the children. The second part is she manages ideas by giving them different activities on the topic. And that is quite a shift from where she was. She saw immediately, it's not just these random activities that keep the kids busy. They're all building on deepening this understanding of this particular topic. And so and then this particular student, quite a lot of them did actually, but not all of them, drew on semantics to give them a language to talk about exactly and precisely what they were doing. So starting from a weaker semantic gravity by understanding, do you understand the concept peer pressure? What does it mean before she explains it? And then going to a stronger semantic gravity when she asks for examples from them of their experiences of peer pressure. The semantic wave goes up again when the students go into a text, and then there's all these connections. She asks questions gives them opportunities to express their understandings and checks their understanding by seeing which activities they find difficult. But all of that was in terms of following this idea of what was happening to the knowledge. let's just have a look at the other 4 students in the class. So all of them have, number one, much longer connections of lesson observation, and all of them have shifted from the bottom upwards, and all of them now at least have one part where they are bringing together not just fragmented activities, but actual patterns. If you look at Lebo on the bottom left, she starts saying the teacher does this, the teacher does this, the teacher does this, and for this reason, and da 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 da. And all of this is to do this, which was mediate the concept of peer pressure. So she brings it up to that pattern right at the end. Let's just, what I want to share with you is that what we asked them to do for the exam equivalent at the end of the year was we wanted them to take their lesson observation report that they wrote in February and take the one that they wrote in August and compare them and say, what did you learn by 6 months of university coursework? What can you see in the teaching that you couldn't see up front? What do you notice that you didn't notice? What did you notice, but now you can describe in more detail? What seemed significant to you then, but less significant now? And I've just got a couple of quotes from the very students that we have been, I've been sharing their work with. So she said that, Nhlanhla said at first she focused on how the teacher delivered the lesson in a well-planned way and giving the children activities. And we saw that, the teacher's doing this, now she's giving the kids to do that, and so on. And she says in that essay, I didn't pay attention to how the teacher was working with the concept of peer pressure. I was much too focused on what the students were doing in their groups. And of course, the fact that they were all participating and enjoying and so on. Lebo, the other one that I shared, she didn't notice the interchange of information, that's what she calls it, between the teacher and the student, and that influenced the flow of the lesson. So again, it's this fragmented, seeing things fragmented and seeing this learning process, the flow. And she said that she's no longer looking at a lesson just from the student's perspective, but she also realizes the significance of what the teacher needs to know and understand of the topic. And Safina said she can now describe in more detail the different strategies that the teachers use, and she's more aware of how the teacher makes the lesson inclusive and how they worked with content knowledge. And so not only was there a shift in the semantic density, but also there was a shift in the focus. They were less focused on having fun and enjoyment and far more focused on what the teacher was doing to enable learning. So the problem that we were addressing here is sink or swim approaches in work-based learning can lead to variable outcomes. Some students cope, some students learn a lot, others don't. And at worst, this can lead to superficial, fragmented understanding of practice. So our studies both came at different angles of thinking about how to make the most of work-based time, how to make the learning happen. And so Cecile's study looks at the added value of the supervisor, making links between the principles, the protocols, the theory, and what's happening in treating this patient in the here and now. And my study is preparing them to go back to the schools where they are not just observing the routines, but actually the intentions, the coherence, and the conceptual progression in the lesson. Because without that, they're just going to be in this thing of fragmented learning. So just wrapping up now, I'm going to bring it back to LCT. And we started by saying that LCT gives us a multidimensional framework to analyze practices. So we've shown you how we've used semantics to analyze practice and see possibilities for changing them. So we were able to start saying, well, when we have this kind of intervention, what's the effect on what students are doing in the workplace and what codes they're able to enact and how long they're able, how they're enacting things, how they're enacting those different codes. There are different ways you can use LCT. You can look at how knowledge works in different kinds of practices like history and science, how different groups of people enact a practice, these groups compared to that, how practices change in different contexts, this place compared to that place. But the way that we used it in our studies is that I looked at how practices change over time. So when the students were, the reason I've got Dr. Seuss's thing 1 and thing 2 is what are the two things that we're comparing? I compared what did they notice right at the beginning of their teacher training where they hadn't even had a single lecture yet, and what could they notice after 6 months. That was my thing 1 and thing 2 that I compared. And Cecile looked at the value of different arrangements. Her thing 1 was with a mentor or supervisor, and her thing 2 was without. And the semantics gives us that visual representation that allows us to see exactly what's happening and what the changes are. So we compared the basis of legitimation. Cecile looked at semantic codes and distribution patterns. I worked with the range of semantic density, looking at the profiles and the degree of segmentation in their understanding of classroom practice. And then just to wrap up, the 2 papers that this study is based on, the first one that's there, Annette is a co-author on this paper together with Cecile and myself, Navigating the Real World, the Value of Supervising Honors Students During Their Home-Based Visits. So that's been published. I adapted the Langsford and Rusznyak study. That one deals with PGCE students. I looked at first-year students in a 4-year degree. And then I've got a forthcoming paper that I call Back to School, Preparing Student Teachers to Observe Classroom Practice, and that's coming out later this year. So from us, thank you, Tak. And what we were really interested in is, are these findings relevant to other fields? And, we're still thinking about the possibilities of using specialization, the social plane, or autonomy with the same data. And any other thoughts?
Thanks, Lee and Cecilie. Anybody take a moment, have a think? Any thoughts, any ideas? Just jump in. Di, just jump in.
Yeah. Thanks, Lee, and thanks again, Cecile. Really stimulating presentations. I'm just wondering, Lee, with the students that you've looked at, they've responded to the observations of others. Have you done any work, or could you do any work where they take that knowledge into, I'm going to say, an observation of themselves, so that they can articulate their practices? So at the beginning, how they describe their own practices to other, and then if they've engaged, if they've used the tools to notice differently others, do they then notice differently themselves? So are they able to take that knowledge into practice? I just think that would be really interesting.
Thanks, Di. So that's really, really interesting. Yes. So we've set up a systematic process of learning to teach here, where the first years, we want them first to observe and analyze others. And then by the time they get to fourth year, they're doing a very similar research project, but on their own practices, on their own reflections. And I've got two publications out on that. There's also a YouTube video where I focused on the fourth years, reflecting on their own practice. So it's on the LCT YouTube channel. I think that was 2022, I think, or 2023 that I did that one. But it's reflecting on practice. So this is where we start them off in the first year, and that's where we get them to in the fourth year. But so we're definitely making this very deliberate shift between observing and analyzing others to thinking about your own, and then analyzing what you're doing and what you're not doing.
Lovely, thank you, Lee. And then just in terms of connections with other, so in the English context, we're about to start an apprenticeship with called specialist teaching assistants. So looking at teaching assistants doing the equivalent of a foundation degree. And we're looking to take this as so developing a different pedagogy of practice with that teaching assistant community, and what's the knowledge, what's similar and different to the teacher community. So it's really useful in being able to take over, because there's a lot of dialogue in the UK context about apprenticeships being the poor relation. And I think it's a poor relation when work-based learning is lacking that conceptual element. But actually apprenticeships could be really powerful if we've got a different pedagogy of practice. So, thank you for today's presentations. They've been really helpful in that field for us.
Thanks for that. Anybody else got anything they want to just jump in or say or comment or whatever? I often find that talks are a really bizarre way of trying to get engagement, because people are often processing everything they've been listening to. And then you have that, what do the French call it? The thing about being on the stairs or something. The thought on the stairs or whatever it is, which is this idea that you suddenly have when you've left a conversation, and then you think, oh, damn, now I've got the thought, and then I'm going to go back and say that. But jump in if you have. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap this up and say thanks everybody for coming on. Thank you, Cecilie, and thank you, Lee, as well. I think the work is extremely exciting, and talking about Lee's work there for a minute, that's right, the Mur de l'Escalier, something like that, yeah. I think it's really interesting to be able to see that difference between where students were at the start and then where they are later on. And to be able to see that in a way that is much more systematic and make it visible, when obviously a lot of that would be said, we do this, people would say, oh, I do that anyway with my examining or my marking or whatever it would be. But to be able to show it quite systematically is valuable in so many different ways, as Lee was saying, in terms of things like being able to justify a course, being able to show what things are being added, as it were, value added again. And particularly if you think like teacher education, where you get every few years, some idiot in some government somewhere just thinks that teaching can be done by people just because they've had kids. And so they start talking about parents doing teaching, as if teaching profession is absolutely no professional knowledge of its own. Again, to show, or they say, oh, no, we need to get all the teachers into schools and they can just learn on the job, which is a fabulous way of ensuring the next generation of teachers are even worse than the previous ones. And, like to be able to show, look, actually, this is the value added of university courses, for example. And I think that could be the same for all sorts of fields which have an element of being in a university and being out there, so to speak. A lot of work-based learning and stuff, where there is often a sense that I think that people do not see. I think they see the rhizomatic code and the prosaic code. So they tend to lock things together to be, if it's abstract, it's complex, and if it's concrete, it's simple. And then they don't see anything else. So they don't see things like the value of worldly codes, things like quite concrete, quite practical, quite embedded or embodied in particular situations, but still complex knowledge is required. So, for example, professional education, vocational education often has their worldly codes working in it, teacher education as well, where you have to be quite hands-on or quite practical and quite present, but at the same time, it is complex. And if you don't see that distinction in the semantic density, then you're just going to end up thinking, as they often do, that things like professional or vocational education are just sort of, basically the same as everyday knowledge almost, or practical, experiential knowledge. I've done a bit of this, therefore, I don't need we don't need to have these areas of education. And you can see that in the policies of so many educational policies of governments over the last few decades in countries like Britain, anyway, and Australia, so yeah, I think this sort of work is really exciting for people in professional and vocational education, as well as elsewhere as well, because we are being pushed in, for example, sociology to do work-based learning, whatever the hell that means. I don't know what that means, by the way, in sociology, but there you go. So I think, if we can find these ways of being able to show that we've added this to the way in which students are understanding stuff, then we're going to be well on the way to being able to do something a lot more than the appalling student survey forms that we have to fill out. Well, I mean, I'd like to be able to fill them out. I mean, but we get the students to fill in, which in my case, I don't know about other people, but in my case is usually just a form of anonymous trolling. But then that's me. I'm a Marmite lecturer. You actually think I'm great, or you absolutely despise me, one or the other. So, Anyway, yes, so I'm dribbling on. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And thank you, Lee and Cecilie, for that. And I hope to see you all in 2 weeks' time. We've got semantic tours. Never heard of that before, so we're going to do that in 2 weeks.